Hey everybody! So in this video we're going to go over the PowerPoint on The Story of an Hour. So this was one of the short stories that you were asked to read for homework last week. And today we're going to go over it in more detail and look at all of the literary elements that we talked about 2 weeks ago. And then try to figure out what the theme of this story is, what it's all about. Alright, so in the story, we learn that Mrs. Mallard, our main character, has just been told that her husband has died in a terrible, tragic train accident. And her first reaction is to fall apart and cry. She's not in shock, as she says some women would be, or what the narrator tells us. She immediately breaks down. And then, within just a couple paragraphs, short paragraphs, she has retreated to her room to be alone. And while she's in the room, she, thinks about all sorts of things. We'll get into that later. And then finally, towards the end, her sister Josephine knocks on the door and asks her, it's time to come back downstairs. And while they are coming back down the stairs, the front door opens, and lo and behold, there is Mr. Mallard, perfectly fine and alive. And Mrs. Mallard sees him and collapses and dies from a heart attack. And the doctors said that it was her heart. We've been told that she had a heart problem already, but it was indeed her heart, and that she died from the joy that kills. So that joyous surprise of seeing her husband alive was too much for her, because of all of the emotions that she just went through thinking that he had died. And so they assumed that it was such a good surprise that her heart couldn't take it. And the question then is, are they right? Is that why her heart gave out? Was she so overjoyed to see her husband alive that her heart couldn't take it and couldn't take that stress, even though it's a good stress, and that's why she died? Is that accurate? Well, we will find out. So let's look at all of those literary elements that we learned about a couple weeks ago. Structure, imagery and symbolism, point of view, and setting and atmosphere, and then look at the theme. So let's look first at the structure of the story. Kate Chopin uses a very specific structural and stylistic technique that helps heighten the drama of the piece. The story is short. The title tells us it's the story of an hour. So the action in the story only takes place within 60 minutes. And, sure, there are some stories, we were going to tell a story about what happened during a 60-minute time frame. Depending on which 60-minute time frame we chose, that actually could be very action-packed and there'd be a lot going on. But in this case, it's actually a very low-impact 60 minutes physically. There's not a lot of action going on. It is all internal. Alright, so emotionally is where the crux of that 60 minutes rests. Alright, so she tells us in the title, though, it's the story of an hour. So to help mirror that time frame, she structures the story with very short paragraphs. Sometimes they're only a sentence or two long. And then it's it's clear, you know, that these very short paragraphs sort of represent the quick passing of those 60 minutes. The story is very short, it's very dense, and it mirrors the intensity. The structure mirrors the intensity of that hour, the emotional intensity of it. All right? There's no room for background information. There's no flashbacks. There's no flash forwards. There's no excessive narration. It's very compact, and every sentence is important. So, the structure mirrors the title, if you will, The Story of an Hour. This is how Chopin felt like the story of an hour should be told, how she structured it. If you look closely at the writing, it's almost poetic in a way. You know, she has a lot of repetition to highlight important points. You know, she has words like open and free that get repeated. You know, the phrases in the sentence structure. You know, she breathed a quick prayer that life might be long. It was only yesterday that she had thought with a shudder that life might be long. So the repetition of that phrase of, you know, life might be long, it draws our attention to it because of the repetition. So we know that there's something important being said, right? You know, the repeated phrase, you know, at the end of each sentence, there, it also reveals how much Mrs. Mallard's life has changed, you know. In a very obvious way, of course, but also in a deeper, more meaningful way that we'll talk about. Almost poetic with the alliteration and the internal rhyme, you know, with phrases like revealed and half concealing, or composedly carrying. You know, a lot of poetic devices used, even though it is prose. And if you think about it, you know, in poetry, poets have to use those poetic devices and that poetic language because they have to put so much into such a short work in order to convey the story and the feeling and the theme and the message that they want the reader to get. So, Chopin is writing in prose. It's not poetry. But she employs the techniques of poetry within the structure so that she can do the same thing, so that she can pack in as much as possible in a very short amount of time. So it's very cool how it's not poetry, but it sounds like poetry sometimes. You know, Mrs. Mallard experiences a very intense and emotional hour. And because of the way that Chopin has structured the story with those paragraphs and that use of poetic language, we end up experiencing that hour right along with Mrs. Mallard. You know, we feel with her as she begins to uncover that unexpected joy after finding out her husband was dead. And then we, just as unexpectedly, are shocked by the ending. Not only that Brittany Mallard is still alive, but also then what happens to Louise. So, Chopin draws us in with the structure, and it mirrors the story, and it allows her to pack as much in during that hour without bogging it down with things that aren't necessary, so that we are able to focus on the emotional journey that Mrs. Mallard experiences. So it's kind of cool. The imagery and symbolism of the story. There's a lot of imagery of springtime while Mrs. Mallard is sitting in the room looking out the window. You know, we get this line, tops of trees that were all a-quiver with the new spring life. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. There were countless sparrows were twittering in the eaves. Patches of blue sky showing here and there through the clouds. Spring days and summer days and all sorts of days that would be her own. So a good chunk of the imagery that we get is those images of the outside world, which happens to be springtime, that Mrs. Mallard is seeing and sharing. Well, that the narrator is sharing. So, what do we make then of those images of springtime? Well, we'll see. So, another image that, obviously, that we get a lot of is the crying, the weeping. You know, and it says in the beginning when she first finds out, she did not hear the story as many women have heard the same, with a paralyzed inability to accept its significance. So basically what that is saying is that most women during that time, if they were told that their husband had just died unexpectedly, they would have been in shock. They would have been paralyzed and they would not have believed that it was true. That's not how Mrs. Mallard reacted. Mrs. Mallard immediately started crying with sudden, wild abandonment in her sister's arms. When the storm of grief had spent itself, she went away to her room alone. So that's the first instance of her crying. Just that, abandonment and sobbing. And then she's in the room. And this section says, she sat with her head thrown back upon the cushion of the chair, quite motionless, except when a sob came up into her throat and shook her, as a child who has cried itself to sleep continues to sob in its dreams. So she's in the chair with her head back, and she's pretty calm and still, except from time to time, a sob would come up into her throat and shake her, just like that image of a child crying while it's asleep. And then there's another reference to the weeping, the crying. She knew then that she would weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death. So here she's imagining her husband's funeral, and at this point she has stopped crying while she's in the room. And as she's thinking about the funeral and their relationship, she knows that she'll cry again when she sees his, at his funeral. She'll cry again. But for now, she's not crying. As she imagines the funeral, she imagines she will weep again. But once the funeral in her mind is over, she never cries again in the story. So that's interesting. She goes through this progression, right? So the first instance of crying is that guttural, wild abandonment upon hearing that he's dead. And then she retreats to the room by herself and starts thinking about things. And occasionally a sob will come up and sort of shake her. But then it subsides. And then she starts imagining the funeral, and she knows that she'll cry again when that happens. But right now she's done crying. There are no more tears for the rest of the story. And that might be surprising to a lot of readers. A lot of readers would probably expect that it would be tough for her to stop crying, during this hour. The hour immediately following the news that her husband has died. Right? What do we make of all that imagery? The imagery of springtime and the imagery of the weeping. we will get to that. Let's look at the symbols next. So the biggest, I won't say the biggest, the first symbol that we come across in the story of an hour is Mrs. Mallard's heart trouble. We're told in the beginning, knowing that Mrs. Mallard was afflicted with a heart trouble, great care was taken to break to her as gently as possible the news of her husband's death. So in the beginning, we're told she has heart trouble, and that's why Josephine and Richards are there to tell her about her husband and to try to soften the blow as much as possible so that the news does not kill her. Right? Then we have another reference to her heart, while she's in the room alone looking out the window. And it says, now her bosom rose and fell tumultuously. She was beginning to recognize this thing that was approaching to possess her. And she was striving to beat it back with her will, as powerless as her two white, slender hands would have been. Like with the beating of her, her bosom rising and falling, she's breathing heavy, basically. And she's trying to push back this feeling that is starting to overtake her, right? Her pulses beat fast, and the coursing blood warmed and relaxed every inch of her body. So as this is happening, and she gives into it, her heart's beating fast, and it actually relaxes her once she gives in. She also talks about love, which would be a matter of the heart, right? And perhaps might be heart trouble. When she's thinking about their relationship while she's in the room, she says, or the narrator says, and yet she had loved him sometimes. Often she had not. What did it matter? What could love, the unsolved mystery, count for in face of this possession of self-assertion, which she suddenly recognized as the strongest impulse in her being? So she's talking about love there. Sure, she loved him sometimes. Other times, maybe not so much. But what did that even matter? What's love got to do with it? What did that even matter, in the face of what she's beginning to feel, right? This impulse, the strongest impulse in her being. So the heart trouble is perhaps that there's not enough heart, not enough love in the marriage, because she also makes a point to say that, like, he didn't treat her badly, it's not like, even though you might get the feeling that she was abused or neglected in some way, she kind of puts those theories to rest, because she says there's really nothing wrong. He was a decent husband. But then she goes into this and she says something about marriage, about how, no matter what, at the end of the day, marriage is just two people trying to impose their wills upon each other. She doesn't blame it on him because he's a man, because she admits that, as part of that marriage, the wife, tries to do the same thing. And that seems to be why she has a bit of a problem. She just didn't really love him all that much. That's heart trouble. And then, of course, at the end, we come back to the heart trouble. When the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease, of joy that kills. So at this point, looking at the imagery and the symbolism, you have to ask yourself with the symbol of her heart trouble here, was it indeed the joy that kills? Did she die happy because he was still alive? And I think that the answer to that question is why her heart trouble is a symbol in the story. So we'll come back to that. Another symbol is the open window. So the whole time Louise is in a room, she's sitting in that chair and she's looking out the open window. And she's looking outside. And that's when we get the imagery of springtime. And springtime is associated with rebirth, new life, right? It's hope and optimism. Everything is possible in springtime. She sees the blue skies and the clouds, so the air, and she sees the birds. It's freedom, right? The open window gives her a glimpse of what her life will be like now that she's a widow. What happens when she finally turns away from the window? Well, she goes back downstairs and her husband is actually alive. But for that brief moment, that 1 hour that she was in that room by herself, looking out that window, everything that she sees are imagery of freedom and new life, new beginnings. So the open window is a symbol for her newfound freedom. Because now she's no longer obligated to be a wife. And why would that be important? We're going to keep going. Let's talk about point of view next. Okay? So, do you remember when we talked about point of view, there was a list of different types of point of view. You know, we have our first person point of view, where the main character is the one telling us the story. So, they're not only telling it to us, but they are the main person involved in the action. We also had a second person narrator who is still a character in the story, you know, but not the main character. So they might be involved in the action a little bit, or they might really just be on the outside observing everything. But they are there, and they are a character, and they're sharing the story with us. And then we had several types of third person narrators. The first part of this story, the first two paragraphs, are what we call objective point of view. And if you remember, objective point of view is when the narrator can only tell us what is, you know, observable. So what the characters say and do. They do not have, that narrator, the objective narrator, does not have access to the character's thoughts or feelings. So the story begins while Mrs. Mallard is in the company of others, right? She's not alone. She starts off with her sister and the family friend there, and at this point she thinks she's still a wife. She does not know yet that her husband has died. So while she is still a wife in front of other people, it's an objective point of view. Almost as if there are no thoughts and feelings of her own in the beginning. She doesn't have her own thoughts. She doesn't have her own feelings. So an objective narrator will do just fine, because we don't need access to her thoughts and her feelings if she doesn't have any at that point. The whole middle of the story, the bulk of the story though, is in limited omniscient point of view. So now we don't have access to any of the other characters' thoughts and emotions, but now we do have access to Mrs. Mallard's thoughts and emotions. So as soon as she goes upstairs and shuts that door and she's alone in that room, she is now able to express herself. She is now able to have thoughts and feelings of her own. And the narrator switches then in order to share those with us. Right? While she's in that room, she thinks she's a widow. She thinks that she's no longer a wife. At that point, she still believes her husband has died. You know, she's free to express her thoughts and her feelings. And this quote here that I have on the slide, it says, she would live for herself. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. She would live for herself. She would no longer be married. She would no longer be in that battle of wills that is always there between husband and wife. She gets to feel that, and she gets to express it because she's no longer a wife and she's alone in a room by herself. And then Josephine comes back for her, and they go back downstairs, and the point of view shifts back to the objective point of view. So in the end, Mrs. Mallard again, she's not alone. In the end, she is again surrounded by Josephine and Richards and then her husband. So the non-death of her husband means she is still a wife. She returns to the beginning where there are no thoughts and feelings of her own. She is not able to live for herself as she thought she was going to be able to. I don't know about you, but I love that. I love how clever. I love how clever the use of point of view was. You know, that was brilliant on Chopin's part to construct it in that way. It's very subtle, but it's there. And if you go back and look, this is exactly the way it happens. Those shifts in point of view. It's very cool. But we're getting a sense now that we've sort of talked about the structure, looked at the imagery and the symbolism, and now the point of view, we're starting to get a feel for what Mrs. Mallard really went through and what we're supposed to take away from the story. It really has to do with what she thought her life was about to become as a widow. And then what it did to her to suddenly have it gone again. Right? Just as suddenly as her world changed in the beginning by finding out her husband was dead, in that short hour she underwent this very deep change, and then her world was completely turned upside down again by the end of the story. So it's very cool how the point of view helps us see into her and why the non-death of her husband forces the point of view to shift back to that objective point of view where she cannot express herself anymore. Alright, so setting an atmosphere. This is pretty important. Setting and atmosphere are really integral to understanding what's going on in this story. So the location of our setting, it takes place in, for the most part, in Mrs. Mallard's bedroom, right? She's confined within those four walls, much like she feels confined in her marriage, confined as a wife. So perhaps the location is also a symbol. The open window, as we already know, represents the freedom she has yearned for and believes she now possesses. Right? So that's our location. not just in the house, but specifically in that bedroom by the window. The time in which the story takes place is the same time in which it was written, so the late 1800s. So consider the state of women's rights during that time, and consider the roles that women were expected to play during that time. You know, you were a wife, you were a homemaker, and more than likely a mother. You know, husband was head of everything, totally in charge. Wife was there to, you know, support him and make him happy and keep a nice, clean house, prepare good meals, and probably raise some kids, right? That was her job. And if you weren't married yet, if you were still young enough to not have a husband, you could perhaps have some sort of job, but the jobs available would have been very limited. And once you reached a certain age, you were expected to be married, and once you were married, you no longer worked. And if you passed that certain age and you still weren't married, then people really started to feel sorry for you, right? And maybe even not just feel sorry for you, but look down on you, like you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. So consider Mrs. Mallard's joy at suddenly being a free woman, through no fault of her own. You know, nobody can say that she's undesirable or that she's not a true woman, you know, like something was wrong with her, that no one wanted to marry her. No, she did it. She did everything she was supposed to do. He's dead. Thank you very much. Right? See ya. Deuces. Through no fault of her own, she finds herself a free woman during a time when that was not an easy thing to accomplish. So the time frame, the setting in terms of time, is super important to what the character experiences and what we're supposed to get from it, right? Because like I said, it's not just taking place in the late 1800s. Kate Chopin wrote this in the late 1800s. So quite a commentary on the state of, you know, equality of the sexes at that point. So the setting, of course, can lead to developing an atmosphere, sort of like the tone of the story, right? So for this particular one, the tone, the atmosphere, is kind of related to the point of view. They kind of go hand in hand, right? So in the beginning, again, we're in that public room with the objective point of view. And that, you know, that objective point of view takes away all emotion, right? So it's very emotionless. It's almost like it's spiritually dead, you know, the atmosphere in the beginning, because it's so objective. But then in that whole middle section, when she's upstairs in the room, you know, and the point of view changes to the limited omniscient, you know, we get the open window, and we get those signs of spring and new life and rebirth, and that the tone, then the atmosphere is one of sort of, it's very lush in a way. We get all of this imagery of nature, you know, and it's very calm and peaceful and serene. But then what she's associating with these images, what she sees outside, it also brings in the atmosphere, kind of takes on a hopeful and optimistic tone, right? So it's, despite the sad thing that just happened, there is a lot of good stuff, a lot of very happy, positive stuff happening in that room. And the atmosphere that is created reflects that positivity. And at the end, again, we go back downstairs, back out in public, around other people. Her husband is alive, so she is once again a wife. That point of view changed to objective view. And we are right back there to that emotionally, spiritually dead atmosphere. Very cold and clinical. So the effect is that the mood is one of emotionless spiritual deadness, the effect of that atmosphere is that it shows us the impossible dream for a woman in that time and place to be free and independent. So that's pretty cool too. So what do we get when we put all of that together? You know, what did we learn about Mrs. Mallard? What did we learn about the structure of the story? How does the structure affect our understanding of it? What images and motifs and symbols did we find? What do they reveal to us about the story? What did we learn about the point of view, and what does that tell us about the story? What did we learn about the setting and atmosphere, and what did those tell us about the story? When you put that all together, you get the theme. Okay? So the first theme is the female search for identity. That very compact, dense structure and that use of poetic language. Every sentence is important. We get right to the heart of the matter, and we understand exactly what Mrs. Mallard is thinking and feeling, because everything is so efficient and effective in the confines of the structure. We get that imagery of springtime, the things that are associated with birth and new beginnings. That's almost enough right there. Just the open window and the imagery outside is almost enough to make us see what the theme is. But on top of that, you know, we also have the weeping motif, right? Because, you know, she weeps with wild abandonment at first, and then she's trying to, you know, control it, keep it down, but she's not only trying to keep the weeping, the sobs down, she's also trying to hold down this other feeling that's starting to overtake her as she's looking out the window at all the signs of birth and new beginnings, and birds in the air, and the clouds in the sky, these images of freedom. She can't keep it down. It comes out. It bubbles over, and that's when she realizes she's free. You know, body and soul free. And she doesn't cry after that. She imagines that she will at his funeral, but she doesn't actually cry again after that. So that the imagery outside the window, paying attention to the pattern with the weeping, knowing what her heart trouble is all about, that helps us understand what she's feeling, right? That she has felt confined as a wife, and now that she's a widow, the world is hers. She can live for herself. The point of view kind of helps back that up as well, you know, because when she's in that room, that's the only time that we have that limited omniscient narrator who allows us access, because she can only express them in that location. When she is in public places and around other people, and when she is a wife, she can't do it. So we learn that the theme then is about the female search for identity. Independence is a forbidden pleasure that can only be imagined in private. Mrs. Mallard behaves as expected when she hears about her husband's death, as she wept at once with sudden wild abandonment. But in private, she begins to realize she is now an independent woman, and this excites the crap out of her. But it goes against society's expectations, so she's trying to stifle that joy by beating it back with her will. But she can't escape the joyous feeling, and the word free escapes her lips. So that setting in that confined room, the symbol of the open window, the imagery of springtime, all reinforce this conflict between the repression and the freedom. Right? When her husband returns, he unknowingly that independence away from her. So the forbidden joy of independence disappears as quickly as it came, and that brief taste of freedom and having it taken away was enough to kill her. So the joy that kills is not the joy of seeing her husband alive. The joy that killed her was the joy she experienced in that 1 hour being taken away because he's still alive. It sounds really harsh. You know, it's not like she wished for him to be dead. You know, she's not happy that he's dead. But she is definitely looking to the future. She is definitely seeing the bigger picture. And while a lot of women might be, let alone might be more attached to their husbands and love them a little more than what the Mallards seem to love each other, but even beyond love, a lot of women would probably be terrified not knowing if they could be independent, if they could, exist without their husbands. Mrs. Mallard's like, whatever, let me at it, let me try, because this is the best thing. This is the best thing ever. Not that he's dead, but just that she can be her own independent person. So that's our first theme. Our second theme is the repressive nature of marriage. It kind of goes hand in hand with the female search for identity. But, by 1890 standards, she should have been very happy, Mrs. Mallard. She had a pretty decent husband who seemed to love her and, wasn't, horrible to her. He treated her well. She even admits that he had never looked save with love upon her. So, dissecting the syntax of that sentence, it's basically saying he only looked at her with love. He never looked at her with any other kind of feeling. So, Brantley Mallard loved her, right? Yet, her face still bespoke repression, because no matter how kind her husband was, he still imposed his will on her. She even hints, as I've said before, that perhaps she had oppressed her husband just as much, because she says there would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. And then when she's in her room and she's, imagining her life as a free, independent woman, she keeps saying, free, body and soul, free. She's not free of him. She's free of the marriage. She's free of that confinement, those prescripted roles that, they're required to play. She's free of simply having to be connected to somebody for every minute of every day for the rest of her life, that she cannot just live for herself. And when she learns that he's alive and the vision of freedom is shattered and she's a mere wife again, at the end she escapes the marriage the only way that she has then, which is her own death. She thought she had a way out of it when Brantley was thought to be dead. But once he shows up back alive, and she's had this taste of freedom for that past hour, it's not like she kills herself, but, her heart's like, I'm done. Right? Cash him in. We're done. So, our second theme then is the repressive nature of marriage. So, in review, we have this really cool structure. We have some really beautiful imagery, but more importantly, very specific imagery that really clues us into what she's thinking and feeling during that hour and what it means. The point of view helps us figure it out, and the setting and the atmosphere help us figure it out. Right? That we have a woman whose husband has just died, and while she is sad about it, at the same time she cannot help but be so hopeful and future, now that she will no longer be a wife, she will now be a widow, and she will be independent and totally free to live her life for herself. And what it did to her to have that taken away so suddenly. Even though she'd only had it for an hour. That's how intense the experience was. Even just having it for an hour and losing it was enough to kill her. So, that was the story of an hour. It was pretty groundbreaking back when it was written. Again, it's written in the late 1800s. Commentaries on marriage like this were not super popular back then. So Kate Chopin definitely was one to stir the pot in a lot of ways, in a good way. But anyway, if you have any questions, anything that you're still not sure of, any additional ideas that you might have with this story, I'd love to hear them. Just let me know. Otherwise, you guys are free to move on to the next item.